Stephen, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today in the Penthouse Suite interviews. This is a virtual version that we're doing. For obvious reason, the entire conference is virtual. But the first thing I want to do was to thank you for spending time and taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join in Charleston. Even if I'm having to do it virtually, I'd much rather be there in Charleston in person, but it's still nice to join in.
Yeah, well, normally we would do this in the Penthouse Suites of the Francis Marion Hotel, but we're doing it through Zoom this go around, and we're looking forward to it. We're looking forward to talking to you. And I wanted to start off by noting that you and your panelists are going to be presenting at the Charleston Conference a session entitled, "What Would It Really Take to Achieve the OA Transition? An Open Take from a Publisher, a Librarian, and a Funder." And in the abstract to the presentation, it says that you all will be providing an honest take on the OA transition. From your perspective, what does that honest take look like?
Yeah, so I mean, we definitely didn't intend to imply that anyone else's take on the open access transition was in any way other than honest. You know, I mean, it's inevitably, you know, it's a massive, complicated, systemic change for the whole scholarly communication system, and so naturally, people are going to have different takes on it, and there are going to be strong advocates of this position and that position, and that's fine, and that's fair enough, and that's how it should be. We all need to be robustly arguing for the way we see this transition as going and what we see as needing to take. I guess from my point of view, I think what we were trying to get at in referring to it as honest was I think what we were trying to indicate was what I wasn't going to do was to sort of stand up and give a kind of pitch for how everything that publishers do is wonderful, and if you guys out there could only appreciate us better, then everything will be fine, and maybe pay us a bit more. So I think it was trying to stand a bit aside from the interests that your own section of the scholarly communication represent, and sort of speak to what does this transition mean for the system as a whole, and trying to do that in a way that was not sort of representing your own interests. That's as far as I'm trying to convey. And in terms of why I think that's, well, I mean, I think it's obvious why I think it's important, but I think in terms of why I think I might be in a position to do that, I think that's partly to do with coming from SAGE. I think, I mean, I don't know if people may already be aware of this, but I think SAGE is quite a distinctive player in terms of the scholarly communication space. Mm-hmm. We're this company that was set up and founded by a very visionary publisher, Sarah McCune, who her passion in life is the dissemination of knowledge. She wants the company to be a company that is committed to that as the fundamental DNA, the purpose for which the company exists, and that's embedded in her long-term plans for the company, that ultimately will end up the ownership of the company, beneficial ownership, will pass to universities and education charities. So that approach is embedded in the company's thinking from the beginning. And then on top of that, I'm, as well as being a sort of very long-term member of the sort of senior management in SAGE, I'm involved in a scholarly communications business in other ways. So, for example, I'm one of the board of directors of Manchester University Press here in the UK. And so I'm seeing the scholarly communications issues and the changes and the challenges, not only from the point of view of a sort of a biggish journal publisher, but also from the point of view of a small university press. And so you're getting different kind of lenses on the kinds of challenges that.
Thank you, Stephen.
All right. Well, I think, moving on from your honest take on the OA transition, we often talk about the OA transition as if it's inevitable that there will be a universal shift to OA and that we're just sort of waiting for it to happen. Well, the question, do you think it's inevitable that scholarly publishing will one day become completely OA? And why would you think that, or why not?
Okay, well, that's a good question. So, obviously, in terms of crystal ball gazing, I wouldn't say I'm in a position to tell for certain. The totality of the scholarly communication process is going to move to OA. But I think when you, and in particular, if I talk about, there's two main pieces. There's the journals business and the books business. I think from the point of view of the books business, I think there is definitely a big space for open access book publishing, and I'm sure that's going to flourish and grow and be very, very important. But I'm less confident that the totality of the book publishing business, the scholarly book publishing business, belongs in an open access model. And I have reservations about sort of mandates that try to force authors to publish their books in an open access model. On the journals business, as we'll come back to this, but I think, it is happening. I think that there's been a long sort of period of build-up in which people were feeling frustrated about things, and is this going to happen? Is it going to happen fast enough, and so on? I do think that we are now moving into a period in which that transition is underway, and so. I never want to make absolute confident predictions about the future, but I think actually that the journal article is going to be open access in one form or another, and so that's a sort of transition that's now happening. I think in terms of some of the things about that transition, obviously, for Sage, what are some of our concerns in that transition, and what are some of my concerns in relation to that transition? And I think one of the big worries for us about that model, the change, is around what happens to disciplines in which there isn't an obvious model for how they thrive in an open access environment. So I think it's kind of things pretty easy to see how disciplines in which there is massive amounts of research funding can prosper in an open access publishing environment. So the model that Wellcome came up with some years back and has been spreading out since, in which basically you take a small portion of the total research funding that supports the research in the area and say, well, we'll spend that portion of that research funding on the publishing process. Makes good sense, and for those areas which have got massive research funding, that's a good answer. But if you take some of the areas that are so critical for Sage's publishing in terms of humanities and social sciences, there are some areas of that kind of rich research funding within HSS, but there's an enormous amount of important research which isn't funded in that way, whether you're talking about history or philosophy or important parts of anthropology, all kinds of areas within social sciences. So we're very interested in the question as to how do we enable a successful transition to open access that works for those disciplines as well as for the richly funded disciplines. And so, I can talk a bit further about that if it's helpful. I think that that you can see different ways in which this transition can impact for those areas with less research funding. So there are models where you could see it trying to those disciplines still be supported in one way or another effectively through the subscription model, whether that's subscribe to open or whether it's sort of various versions of Green OA. And that has its own ambivalence. Sorry, Tom, are you trying to?
No, I think it's interesting when you think about this question that we speak of the OA transition in a very general way, but can the system accommodate a hybrid existence with some OA and some not OA?
That's definitely possible. I think there are big pressures, though, towards open access across the board. And I think there are ultimately big benefits from open access across the board if we can achieve it in a way that is sustainable and doesn't lead to whole disciplines being effectively disenfranchised. So I think I'm not starting from a point of view of skepticism that says, let's try to hold OA to only happening in certain areas. But I do think that we may end up with different models applying in different areas. And so, for example, maybe gold OA applies across the whole biomedical fields and so on, while a subscribe to open or some other model applies in other areas. And so there's all kinds of challenges of that kind, which I think reflect the differential challenges that we get for different disciplines.
Good, thank you.
Stephen, you also are going to be talking during the session about transformative agreements. And we're wondering, what's been your and Sage's experience with transformative agreements? Have they really addressed the limitations that some people claim the subscription model has? And on the other side, what limitations, if there are any, do transformative agreements have?
Great. Well, that's a great question as well. Yeah. So, I mean, we've been working within transformative agreements, and they are definitely an enlarging portion of kind of how we're migrating into OA. And that is an accelerating path. It sort of started for us, at least, with a deal with the Netherlands a few years ago. By next year, it'll be multiplying out to quite a number of countries in terms of whole countries that will have their content being published open access within a transformative deal, and then sort of individual deals with individual institutions, and so which we can come back to, because they're interesting in terms of the way forward. So I mean, from the country-wide, the kind of big consortial country deals that have been coming out of Europe, I mean, there's at one level, there's a sort of clear immediate gain in terms of moving forward into OA from those deals. You're taking a system where hitherto they've been buying the content and then paying an additional charge on an article by article basis to make individual articles OA. Now, within the transformative deals, the whole content of that system of all the participating institutions will be made available OA. So there's an immediate jump forward in terms of the objective of having more content available at access. I mean, I think the limitation with those deals is the exit strategy in terms of how do you go forward from those deals into a sustainable open access future. And so, I mean, I think the underlying, the ideal behind them is the idea that if the whole world went into transformative arrangements, then every institution in the world would already be paying for its articles being published away. The subscriptions would effectively fall away, and you'd have the whole system now operating in an OA environment. But I think what that doesn't deal with is the fact that actually the costs of the system fall on different actors in an OA future. And so the system at the moment is the costs of the system are spread very much across a very diverse universe. So you've got the research-intensive universities, you've got more teaching-intensive universities, you've got very international, global environment universities, you've got some subscribing actors outside the university systems, whether that's public libraries or pharma companies and all kinds of things. So as you migrate into a pure OA model, the natural funders of that are the research-intensive universities, because that's where the majority of the research is coming from, and then the research funders. And so how do you shift from the transformative deal, which spreads the costs across the traditional subscribing institutions, to that new environment where the money needs to come from a mix between research-intensive universities and research funders? So that's a sort of one big challenge. And then on top of that is the challenge we've already mentioned, which is how do you ensure that all disciplines are funded in that OA future down the road after that transition. So that was the sort of, those two challenges were a kind of what we were trying to achieve in the different kind of transformative deal we did with UNC Chapel Hill last year. And so, I'd be very pleased that the panel I'll be on at Charleston will be with Elaine Westbrooks from UNC Chapel Hill. And I think that was a deal which was set up to try to address both of those transitions. So we're looking to have the research funders support publication of open access articles from UNC Chapel Hill, where they're coming from research funded and by particularly the big funders that have got mandates for open access publishing. And then UNC is able to take funds from the subscription pot to support publication of open access articles in other disciplines. So it's intended to try to support that kind of underlying transformation of the whole business, which the transformative deals up until now haven't really fully, I think, managed to address.
Well, we're very much in a transition, and I'll be interested to see what kind of Q&A you get at the session, because it's a very lively and interesting topic, and I'm looking forward to listening to what you all have to share. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm hoping there'll be enough time. I'm hoping there'll be enough time for a good Q&A session, but it's quite a tight time slot, and we've got to cover the whole of the OA transition.
And I think we might also say in relation to that that question that you don't have transformative agreements with mid-sized universities. You don't have them with colleges. It takes place almost entirely with research-intensive institutions, wealthier institutions. MIT and Harvard are doing them, but Central Michigan is not. So there's a sort of a question there about what's going to happen to everybody who isn't doing transformative agreements in that space.
Well, that's right. I mean, that I think is part of that picture as to where the future lies. I mean, I guess I'm sort of rather imagining that if down the road there would be a situation where institutions which are not so research intensive didn't feel the need in a way to have a transformative agreement, because basically the costs for them of paying for a smaller number of research articles being published within traditional model and within a sort of old APC model wouldn't be so heavy, while the savings to them from the elimination of the subscription model would be substantial. So I think there are potential beneficiaries of the whole transformation for the more the sort of big range of institutions which are not research focused. But there's a big challenge for the research intensive universities, because the costs to them, if the whole system, the cost of supporting the whole system sort of collapse back onto the research intensive universities.
And I think when you think about this question about the OA space, we talked about this earlier, is the transition going to be universal, such that these are transformative agreements which then result in a completely transformed publication space, so that even if you're not research intensive, the transformation has occurred anyway, even if you haven't participated in these. And I think, in the presentation you're going to make, there was a sort of implication that there is polarization in the OA space. And we had talked about the differentials in who has access to OA funding and who doesn't. But I guess I wonder, how do you see the polarization in the OA space, and what do you think are the root concerns of the various stakeholders?
Well, I mean, I think I think we all recognise that there is polarization in the OA space, and as I said earlier, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily entirely a bad thing, in the sense that I think it's fair enough for people to stand up for their different ideas about how the system should be changing, and we can't all have exactly the same opinions, and we all need to robustly defend our own assessment as to how the public interest can best be served, and how to move forward here. I mean, I think the polarization is a bit depressing for people in publishing. I think most people in publishing went into publishing because they actually were quite had a sense of calling, a belief that they were doing something which was supporting the dissemination of knowledge and good things in the world, and sort of getting labeled as the enemies of science and stuff like that. It's quite depressing. So it's the polarization. It's a shame that there's and that there's obviously within the community not everything is polarized. You tend to hear about sort of certain very vocal people expressing positions very vocally, But I think there is also a lot of collaboration, a lot of mutual engagement going on, and people working together from different vantage points to try to advance the whole system. In terms of why polarization, I mean, I think I'd maybe just flag a couple of things. One is, I think in terms of how we got here, I think the reality has been that the journals market that we've lived through the last 50 years has had aspects which are what an economist would call a dysfunctional market. So it's a market that is not functioned optimally. And while that has benefited journals publishers, I think they've been the beneficiaries of some of the dysfunctions in that market. I don't think the dysfunctionality of the market was created by journal publishers. It's emerged out of the way in which the journal business has been incorporated into the academic value system and has been sustained by the academic system in general and the library market as its vehicle. And so, why is that? I don't think I have total answers to that. I mean, I guess, at the heart of it, as is generally recognized, the adoption of the impact factor as a fundamental way of valuing academic research, even though we all know it's not a perfect method for doing that, is probably the biggest single factor in driving that focus on journals as being sort of the essential commodity for the vehicle for research dissemination. And in terms of publishers, there'll be publishers that have lost out, as well as publishers that have gained from that focus on journals. So I think if you're a university press, if you're an academic monograph publisher over the last 50 years, it hasn't been so good. The academic library budgets have shifted heavily away from, in terms of percentage-wise, away from book purchasing towards journal purchasing, and so that's benefited one group of publishers, the journal publishers, and disbenefited another group. So that's in terms of sort of why we got here. I mean, in terms of how we get out of, how we go forward, the polarization. I mean, I think one of the polarizing factors is a perception that there are publishers are kind of restrictive, dragging their feet, resisting the transition into OA, and that the reasons are self-interested reasons around defending their existing interests. And definitely within the major beneficiaries of the system as it stands at the moment of the traditional subscription model are, on the one side, a subset of the publishing industry in terms of journal publishing group in particular, obviously, and that's quite a differentiated group as well. The people tend to focus really on the largest end of that in terms of the big commercial companies, either owned on the stock market or venture capital owned or whatever. And then the scholarly societies, again, are the other major beneficiary of the system as it works at the moment in terms of the subscription model. And so those are the two parties that are beneficiaries of the system as it exists, and for whom there are obviously a difficult transition in terms of how to move into the new environment in a sustainable way. I mean, I think the reasons it's difficult to transition are obviously a self-interest and a reluctance to dive into something that's completely risky, kind of is part of it. But I think a lot of it relates to this difficulty of actually how to transform the system. That if you're trying to move from an environment where the money is flowing from one set of actors to a different set of actors, it's a bit, I suppose, a bit of it is like changing the engines on a plane while it's flying. None of us want to sort of stop the system, land, and do a big transformation, kind of take off again. I think we're trying to re-engineer the whole process in mid-flight, and so it is difficult. And so how to successfully achieve that transitioning from one model to a completely different set of drivers.
Would you say that there's polarization among the publishers as well?
Well, I would say publishers, are not by no means, the publishing industry is quite differentiated. I don't think it's all one set of actors. Even among the big commercial publishers, I think you can see quite different stances being taken between different publishers on, and their attitude to academic self-publishing through ResearchGate and all kinds of things like that. So, and then, the publishing industry is such a range. You've got little independents who are kind of operating at the absolute margins of existence. You've got university presses where, at one level, they've got the support of their institution, but they're often under quite a lot of financial pressures. You've got society publishers who are ultimately in service of the academic goals, but for whom obviously, yes, there's a lot of risk in this transition as well. So I think it's a very differentiated set of spaces.
Yeah, thank you.
Stephen, it's obviously we're in a situation where it's very much a work in progress with both positives and negatives that we're all going to have to work with. And I was wondering, if you were advising librarians, what actions would you recommend that they take to help the scholarly communications industry as we move into this world of more transformative agreements, more open access? And on the other hand, what would you recommend or advise publishers do?
Yeah, so, okay, I mean, there are a lot of different aspects to that. I was just actually hearing about one of them really interestingly from Elaine Westbrooks at UNC Chapel Hill yesterday, in terms of one of the challenges that they've been finding with the arrangement we've got with them on setting things up for OA, that the scale of email incoming phishing effectively expeditions from predatory publishing is so great that the librarian reaching out to an academic and saying we can make your article open access gets lost within this sort of volume of email. And so that challenge, which a lot of librarians I know have already been addressing in terms of how to help the academic community differentiate between what is a genuine, rigorous, credible, scholarly publishing outlet and what is something that is pretending to be that, but is actually not. That's an important part of trying to maintain the credibility of the whole system and for the whole system to migrate forward in a successful way. I mean, I think beyond that, I think sort of the more we can all be aware of the nature of the challenges. So these challenges, like, for example, that the situation for different disciplines in the challenge for different disciplines is going to be quite different in that migration into open access. So focusing on what can we do to help address that. The more we can all kind of sort of focus on trying to help those answers, get the answers to those questions together, I think that would be really helpful for both publishers and for librarians and for the academic community in general. So, I mean, one of the things I see quite often is people who are sitting in one segment of the scholarly communications infrastructure, maybe a medical publisher or whatever, they draw conclusions about how that system works based on the experience they see from that point in the system. Like, for example, that it's feasible to take an APC based on a portion of the total research funding, and for that to drive the publication of your content. And that works in that segment. Mm-hmm. But the idea that you can simply multiply across the entire ecosystem and expect everything to function the same way, I think people need to be aware of the limitations.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, and I guess I have a rather large question. How would you characterize the current state of the OA transition, and how do you see it changing or evolving in the next 2 or 3 years, particularly in the light of the fact that, transformative agreements are usually 3, 4, 5 years, and we're looking at this transition as a transition that will lead to something else. So how do you see that changing?
So, I mean, I think to my mind, stage one of the transition is now really sort of underway. And so I think there's been a lot of frustration over the last 15 years with people sort of perceiving the potential for that transition and feeling that it wasn't really happening. I think it is now happening. I think that the stage which is getting to the point where increasingly the default setting is becoming that primary research content published in a journal article form is one way or another open access on publication is increasingly coming into sight as kind of that's going to be the norm, whether it's the universal or whether it's just normal. Can't say quite what the timeframes are for that, but it feels like it's happening. So I mean, just to, you know, if you think about the last article I saw, which sort of did a kind of sort of rigorous study of that, I think it was a 2018 study, and what they were coming up with was at that point that I think about it was just under 50% of searches were finding an open access version of some kind available, and that were represented something like 30% of the articles published, in that more of the searches related to newer content and a higher proportion of the newer content was away. And so so that's kind of, and that's 2018, and definitely this picture has been continuing to develop in an open access direction since 2018. So I do think that, you know, that's significant. I mean, that's a very different picture from, I think, where we were 5 years earlier. And so the proportion of content that's now OA, one version or one way or another, green, you know, maybe not always 100% kind of compliant green with the publisher's restrictions or whatever, gold, other versions, you know, of OA. It's happening, and it's happening on a larger and larger scale. So I think we are moving into an open access environment, and we are moving towards that becoming more and more the default setting. The questions that, you know, we've been talking around are really, how do we ensure that as we get into that open access environment, that we have a set of sustainable models that enable the academic, the business of rigorous dissemination of academic scholarship, and the differentiation between what is rigorous academic scholarship and what isn't, to happen and sustainably in that new environment. And I think we're, you know, I guess the worry from a publisher's point of view would be, we're getting to the point where we are away a bit sooner than we've cracked all the problems as to how to ensure that there are sustainable answers to how to make sure that all of the disciplines that, you know, are survive that, you know, have a functioning, sustainable model for accrediting academic research in that environment. So it's, I think, you know, we're getting there, but I still feel we've got some way to go in terms of making sure that we're doing that in a way that is long-term sustainable. And sustainable here doesn't mean, you know, maximizing profit margins for publishers. I'm talking about whether credible academic research is validated systematically, sustainably, and in a way that people can identify and understand going forward.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you're very much on target with that, Stephen. We need to maintain quality. Quality research is essential, and this is all. And you know, I suspect. Oh, I don't suspect, but I'm fairly sure that you're right. That we're moving more and more into an OA environment, and the question is, how are we going to get there? And that's where we're going to run into the difficulties and some of the frictions that are going to occur. Stephen, before we let you go, is there a question that we should have asked that we haven't asked?
So, you know, I guess, I was quite grateful not to be asked that more profound, the fundamental question, I guess, of, you know, how do we ensure that the future of differentiating, you know, authoritative, peer-reviewed, validated knowledge is differentiated from the flood of, you know, whether you call it fake news or just kind of self-interested, financially driven, politically motivated, misinformation of all kinds that is often masquerading as academically credible, validated knowledge. And so we are faced with a world which is, it is becoming harder and harder, I think, for people to know, to understand the difference between what constitutes validated knowledge and what isn't. And so that's the fundamental challenge that, and that is a challenge which is the one that we all share in common. So despite all this question of polarization and in a way divisions that exist around models and so on, but actually librarians, the academic community, publishers, at least publishers who are working to publish that kind of legitimated, validated scholarship, we have a common interest in trying to fight that battle together. And so how do we win a battle against a flood of wrong information? And so that's the tough one in terms of, I think everything else is in service of that objective. And I'm sure there are good answers. I mean, I think ultimately education is the heart of it. And so the sustainable long-term project of trying to use the educational system, the higher education system, to get people to understand how they can themselves at the receiving end differentiate between real, validated, research-led, informed opinion versus, on the other side, kind of speculation or misinformation. That is at the heart of what we're all here for.
Well, you're exactly right. We're here for quality information and resources that students and faculty can depend on, and it's really the reason that publishers and librarians are in this business. So, again, Stephen, I want to thank you for taking time out of such, as of what we know is a very busy schedule. And I also want to thank you for your very thoughtful answers. Again, whenever we do this, we always learn something, and your interview is no exception. I learned an awful lot just listening to you. So again, thank you very much.
Well, I very much appreciate the chance to join you. Thank you.